Excellent. As if by magic, the room descends into minor bubbling of silence. I wish this happened with my lectures. It doesn't really happen with my lectures. It's a bit shame, Matt. Well, look, welcome to Should the World Fear China? This is an LSE School of Public Policy public event, jointly branded with LSE Ideas, the LSE Foreign Policy think tank. My name's Alexander Evans. I'm Professor in Practice in Public Policy at the School of Public Policy, an Associate Dean and a recovering diplomat. And joining me is Zhou Bo here on my right, Tian Chen here, and Nigel Inkster here for this event. And I'll properly introduce our speakers shortly, but I have to do that ritualistic health and safety announcement of housekeeping so that you know that you're going to be safe in this room and this building, and you know how this is going to work. So the first thing I'd like you to ask is to try and abandon your addiction to telephones and TikTok and instant messaging and all the urgent WhatsApps that are about to come in. Oh, wait, I have 4 more. So please do turn your phones on to silent so that we're not going to be intruded by alerts and Instagram reels and everything else. The event is being recorded and hopefully will be made available as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties. And as usual, there will be a chance for you to put questions to our speakers. For our online audience, you can submit questions via the Q&A feature on the call at the bottom of your screen. Please do include your name and affiliation. And for those of you here in the theatre, I'll let you know when we open up for Q&A. Please do engage in questions, which can elicit answers. Long speeches disguised as questions are a noble tradition of all universities, but are not necessarily very welcome here this evening. It is linked, this event is, of course, inevitably, there's a book, isn't there? Inevitably, there's a book. And here is the book. This is Should the World Fear China, written by Zhou Bo over here. Available at all good booksellers, but also outside from Hurst and Company, the publishers, at a discount this evening of £10 off a regular hardback price. So you get a third more book for your pound, £20 for the hardback outside. So I do encourage you to have a look at that. I do want to make a slight apology. You will notice that before you is a manel. A manel, for anybody who hasn't heard this, is a panel consisting entirely of males. We do generally try and avoid that at the LSE, and I should say one of the people I'd invited to speak sadly couldn't make it. We don't normally practice manels in the 21st century. And for those ex-users, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Public Policy. So look, the good news is I don't really have to introduce an event about China and the world, right? We know that that is the macro theme that informs world affairs right now. It's a macro theme of trade and tariffs and potentially a deglobalizing world. It's a macro theme of security and technology and rising competition between the United States and China. And it's a central dynamic relationship in international affairs. And the question of what is China's intention in the world? What will China's effect be on the world? How do other states respond to and think about China's return as much as China's rise is a central question that we are hoping to hear more about this evening. I'm not going to introduce our speakers in great detail, but just to say, Zhou Bo is a senior fellow at the Center for International Security. He served in the People's Liberation Army for 41 years, handling military-to-military relations with other countries, including India, right, where I think you've been very closely engaged in India-China negotiations. Tian Chen is the founder and president of the Global Governance Institution, holds a PhD from Wuhan University and an LLM from the University of Nottingham, where he was a FCO Chevening Scholar. So any Chevening Scholars in the room? Any hands going up? There we are, excellent, that's very important. Chevening, soft power, remember that's an ingredient for the UK government and for other governments as well. So welcome here. And also Nigel Inkster, he's a senior advisor at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and a former senior SIS, Secret Intelligence Service, MI6 officer, and a deep China expert. So Nigel, very good to have you join us here too. So without further ado, your floor is yours.
Right. Huh?
It should just work. It should just work.
All right.
Yeah.
Can you hear me like this? Okay, good. Thank you. So, should the world fear China? This is the title of my book, but not the title that I thought of, but it happened to be the first question asked to me by the good German magazine, Die Zeit. I didn't expect that when he asked, Colonel, tell me, should the world fear China? I said, blah, blah, blah. Then I really forgot what I said, but this question actually has been staying with me. So I think it epitomizes Western's feeling toward China in Chinese Taoist Lao Tzu's words. That would be China's rise, fortune or misfortune, right? So first the question is what China is. What China is really in the eyes of the beholder. For the United States, it's a pacing threat. For the European Union, it's a systemic rival, economic partner, and a strategic competitor. And this hodgepodge description of China tells more about EU's confusion about China rather than what China really is. But then if you move toward the bigger world, that is global south, where we have more than 86% of world population, then the pictures would change totally, right? So in that part of the world, people's opinion of China is certainly more certain and more favorable. Yeah. Now, what kind of world are we living in? This is not what I said, but what Munich Security Conference has described. Not only is the world becoming less Western, but Western itself is becoming less Western. And I know that 1 in 3 people in London is born overseas. I look at your faces and I know that, yeah. So this is the world we're in. Then the question is, of course, in a world when China is becoming more and more important, how can China assure the world that it is an anchor or a force of stability for the world, right? So that is a fundamental question. And my answer is, I don't know whether China can make the world better, but China probably can make the world safer. And that is reflected in the fact that ever since 1979, China is not involved in a single country, with a single country. China has not even killed a single foreigner overseas. The only example I can give you is the deadly brawl between Chinese and Indians in 2020, but that is about sovereignty because it's about border dispute. And even in that deadly incident, it's interesting for me to tell you that the 2 modern militaries were fighting with one another in a Stone Age manner. That means they did not shoot at each other. Isn't that wonderful, even if this is most unfortunate? So this is the only example where, well, okay, people died somehow because of China. And let me mention the Philippines. Well, when a big giant like China is in a kind of trouble with a small country like Philippines, people would automatically or instantly become sympathetic with a small country. But what is the fact? The fact is China has not used the force against the Filipino. Yes, the water cannon on camera would be most impressive, but I can argue that is precisely for deterrence of not using force against the Filipino. And the reality is that the Filipinos use force against Chinese because they killed Chinese fishermen in 2000, 2006, and 2013. So this is the fact. Then, could China do more for the well-being of the rest of the world? I think the problem for China is that Chinese people do not understand how the world actually thinks, how important China already is. Some Chinese are still lost in this mentality of victimhood, 100 years humiliation. But look at the war in Ukraine. Immediately after the war in Ukraine, people would ask China, which side would you take? Can you help us? Yeah, why can't Chinese leader pick up the phone and help President Putin to stop? Yeah, so that is the first time, even for a specialist like me, to realize how China has become so important in other people's eyes. Now we come to these questions. Since you are great power, you have to show that greater responsibility. And that's the price you have to pay as a major power. Now, of the J.D. Vance speech at the Munich Security Conference, which I attended, of course, I was greatly shocked by what he said, but probably I would not feel as strongly as Europeans, right? But that is another watershed moment. People again turn to China. They would wonder what China is going to do at this time. I feel that myself because even in one day I could have 4 interviews with the 4 top international media asking almost the same question. So that is where China is standing. So this would really brings these questions where China is heading for. Well, in the last 4 decades or something, China's rise is peaceful. You can never see another country rising so peacefully, to become the 2nd largest economy in the world. So this is already proven. What is the next challenge or another test in front? That is, even if China is becoming stronger, would China become a real force of stability? Or would China become another hegemon, like all others we have seen in the history? This is something we have not seen. But I have some confidence, given what China has been behaving in the last 4 decades. And this is my best hope for my country and for my people.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. First, thank the organizer for inviting the PGI delegation to this wonderful event. It was always very good to be back in UK. I used to boast myself as a Nottinghamer because I studied in the University of Nottingham. At that time, it's a good memory in the kind of what we used to call golden era. But since then, all changed. The Sino-British relationship witnessed many unhappy events. Human rights, Hong Kong issue, the Huawei was banned, lots of happened. But now, since President Trump came into his 2nd office, the global security landscape, geopolitical security landscape is undergoing profound changes. So these changes are evident in several areas. First, the transatlantic divorce and the future of NATO. Have you heard the speech of Vance in Munich? So the question is, in particular for EU countries, for the future of NATO, will NATO still exist as it used to be, or it just exists in kind of non-consequence? And also the second question is, will NATO develop itself? an EU country develop its autonomous defense posture, or what areas do they still hold to develop itself, to build its own defense? That's the first area. And second, the US-Russia determination of Russia-Ukraine conflict and the role of EU. And we know that the United States and Russia, they dictated the trajectory of Russia-Ukraine conflict over the head of the EU. For that, this kind of fact, what kind of role the EU gonna to play in the future of the security architecture of the whole Europe? if you're not on the depot, how are you going to shape the future of the your security architecture? So this is the second point. And third, the Middle East. I mean, with the hardlining policy of Trump, we can see that the Middle East, just the past weeks, the rising numbers of the civilian lives really test what is the minimal moral standards for our human beings. And also maybe you can foresee in the future if the US and Israel bypass the Paris Agreement, then there will be more tensions. In particular, with the conflicts expand, I mean, Syria, Gaza, Yemen, so there will be many refugees. So what will this kind of crisis, refugee crisis, impact the EU as a whole? It's another challenge. And first, I'd like to highlight, again, we are hearing that the kind of the traditional triangular relationship among Russia, China, and the United States come to the focus once again. But will we see a kind of the similar moment of a Kissinger moment? That is another question. Or can we say, why don't we expect a triangular relationship among China, EU, and the United States, or China, EU plus UK together as a EU entity, and in China? So those are the profound changes we are witnessing in just the past a few months. And that's the reason behind it, why such a huge changes taking place. So I would say that the root cause is Trump version 2, as I just listened to a podcast, gave it the name American Revolution. They put it as the key reasons why there are so many changes. And first, of course, there is the re-emergence of the so-called isolationists or Montreux Doctrine back in the United States. But also, as some West media describe it as kind of a revenge of right-wing on the mainstream liberals. Or some others will call it, it's kind of another clash of civilizations. A clash of civilizations between traditional conservative values and open, plural, new thoughts. So this they call it a kind of a new clash of civilizations. So those are some of the reasons why we are witnessing such kind of changes. And also, of course, I think the last point is, I mean, for the reason of the change is that Trump's personal traits, Trump's personal distinctive personality in particular, marked by a transactional approach, capricious decision-making, and inconsistent. So the Trump's personal personality also played a significant role in shaping the changes. And then what's the global implications of this dramatic shift in geopolitical landscape? So given my background as an operating lawyer, I would say that first, we are seeing erosion of post-World War II international order. That's obvious. The traditional collective security system back to the United Nations Charter is not working very well. In particular, as we are saying that when Trump claimed that he's going to take control of Panama River, they're going to get back Greenland, that reminds us, I mean, a kind of general law is coming back. So that's the first impact. Second, it is undermining the traditional international legal system. I mean, this traditional international legal system, I mean, the cornerstone is the basic principle of international law. Some basic principle in international. First, all the treaties should be followed. This is the basic principle. But with many countries are retreating from multilateral treaties, it destroys that basic principle. The second basic principle is non-use of force against in the international relations, as reflected in Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charters. Yes, as you may think of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. When Russia-Ukraine conflict erupted, as a legal scholar, I saw a statement from both the American Society of International Law and the European Society of International Law. They all said that it's the first ever aggression war after the Second World War. But what about Serbia? What about Iraq in 2003 and Libya? So we just think that many people forget about it. I mean, many bad presidents has been late. Then we see other presidents. I'm not saying that the bad presidents made before will become an excuse for the later player. So that's the second implication. And third, I'm thinking of like we are facing a crisis of identity in Western democracy. So we, in the minds of the Asian people, we all think that the democracy, whether it is in the United States or it is in Europe, they are the same. But now, if you look at the vast speech in the kind of ideological confrontation, it seems that the U.S. is destroying what it has created. I mean, like Europe, including the democracy. They are criticizing that what wrong Germany has done and other Europeans. It's kind of there is a problem with the unity of democracy. Of course, there are other, I mean, for democracy, we all know that the general election is a very beautiful thing, but just a change of the government. I mean, when another president comes to office, just look at how the uncertainty it brought, but some people never think about it. So that's the third point I'd like to mention. And also the re-evaluation of U.S. as a leader of the free world. I think you all know what I mean. So whether the United States is still reliable as a kind of a security provider for not only the EU, but also for other countries. And as well, there is a paradox of emerging multilateralism. We all know with the transatlantic divorce, we are expecting that the multilateralism is emerging. But I just wrote an interesting article in The Economist. It even claimed if it comes to standoff, Europe has leverage over America. But my question is, if the EU relies the United States to protect security, how can it use those leverage? Or how can they still use those leverage against the United States? And also, unfortunately, the inevitable nuclear proliferation. I think with these dramatic changes, although the UK and France are claiming that they are going to take care of the EU in terms of the nuclear umbrella, but when other countries feel that the United States nuclear umbrella is not reliable, I mean, like Japan, South Korea, and other countries, will they also take risks? Finally, back to the Sino-British relationship. So I think those dramatic changes in terms of global geopolitical security changes also give an opportunity to rethink about the Sino-British relationship. I mentioned a few examples. I think given the current status of the dramatic changes, I have two questions for our British friends. First, let's just forget about how to repair or improve the relationship. Just ask two questions. First, were Britain's significant decisions to alter China-UK relationship made entirely autonomously, or were they made in the context of a great power competition, essentially choosing sides? That's the first question. Second question, in an era when transatlantic relations are under strain, will Britain retreat to its comfort zone by offering a token of allegiance to the United States, or will it assert its independence, act as its own master? So if the answer to the both questions are yes, and then I think the Britain needs to reevaluate its perception of China and recalibrate the bilateral relations. So my final suggestion is that, in terms of how to improve the bilateral Sino-British relationship, first, all the world expect Britain to position itself as an independent pole in a multipolar world and play a corresponding role. Amid domestic global changes, I think Britain can serve as a stabilizing anchor, uphold multilateralism, and safeguard the process of European integration. In particular, although given the Brexit, I think as an anchor of stabilizer, British can help lead EU from the side. And Britain can collaborate with the EU, encourage its unity and coherence, to view the world through the lens of Europe's historically globally engaged approach. So moreover, during a period of a sluggish global economic recovery, Britain can act as an engine of development, fostering the global prosperity. That's the first suggestion. Second, the traditional US-UK alliance should not be an impediment to developing China-UK relations. Britain can use this alliance as a bridge of communication, reminding the United States when necessary and expressing concerns firmly when required. It should avoid simply playing the role of mediator of American alliance. Worse, taking sides at the expense of other countries' interests. Finally, the development of China-UK relations should fundamentally serve the interests of both countries and both peoples. These relations must not be politicized as a tool to advance domestic agendas, nor should they be weaponized as casualty of great power competition or as a token of allegiance to appease the United States. The ultimate goal should be to maximize the mutual benefits for the peace of both nations. China's policies remains unchanged. Development continues to be China's priority, and a distant China does not pose a threat to Britain. In a new context, improving China-UK relations require Britain to introspect and return to the path of enhancing the relationship. Thank you.
Nigel.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not going to go over the points that have been already made. I think we've heard a very convincing account of the extent to which the world is currently moving from a period of low entropy to a period of very high entropy, with all sorts of uncertain consequences. I want to focus on the China point. And when one looks at China, where it is in the world and what it plans to do, I think essentially we have to listen to two narratives. One is what China says to the rest of the world, and one is what China says to itself. Now, these two narratives don't always synchronize. That doesn't mean that one is false and the other is true. It means that they are addressing different audiences and have different purposes. But if we look at the internal messaging, I think, very much uppermost in my mind latterly has been an article in the Chinese theoretical journal, party theoretical journal Qiu Shi, authored by Xi Jinping, that was published at the beginning of the year. This article was in fact, a revision of a speech that President Xi gave to senior Chinese Communist parties a couple of years prior to that. And that was a very long article, 11,000 characters, and I'm going blind, so I didn't read the whole thing, but I did look through the main points of it. And essentially the message was, that China had to buckle down for a pretty rough ride. There were lots of challenges, lots of threats that were going to have to be overcome. But essentially, China's system was superior to the rest of the world and would eventually prevail. Now, taken out of context, that can look potentially quite threatening, the Klingon Empire planning to take over the planet. That's not what I think is intended at all. Rather, I think, I'm taking a bit of a risk here, interpreting what I think may be in Xi Jinping's mind, is that, the desired end state is a China that is a civilizational pole of such attraction that other countries will naturally want to gravitate towards it. Rather, as in the 1950s, we all wanted Coca-Cola, blue jeans, Elvis Presley, and riding Route 66 on a Harley Davidson. Nobody, the Americans didn't tell us we had to do these things. They didn't tell us we had to want them. We wanted them. And I think ultimately that probably is what China, is really thinking about. It's not about, a sort of takeover of the world. Nor do I think actually China aspires to be a hegemon in the way that the United Kingdom was in the 19th century and the US has been in the 20th. They've looked at our experience in the UK, colonies, very burdensome to administer, and the populations, we give them tea, fair play, and even cricket, god damn it, but they still don't appreciate it, and they want us gone. And we look at the United States, 800 military bases around the world, huge commitments, and I don't think China wants to go down that route either. But I'm not sure China quite knows what it wants to do in that regard. And I'm picking up on what Senior Colonel Zhou said to that point. This is a work in progress. And I'm harking back to a conversation I had in 2007 with a very senior Chinese official responsible for foreign policy. This was at a time when China's formal position remained one of hide and bide. Don't sort of push yourself forward. And I was saying, okay, fine, but you guys are acquiring lots of interests around the world, and at some point you're probably going to have to think about how you want to protect and preserve those interests. And when that starts to happen, you could potentially find yourself in the sort of dynamic that we in the UK underwent in the 19th century. As the British historian Sir John Seeley observed in relation to the British Empire, it seems that we have managed to conquer half the world in a fit of absence of mind. There was never a plan. We never intended to do this. It just sort of happened. One thing led to another, and all of a sudden, 25% of the world was painted pink. I don't think America actually really intended, to end up playing the role that it did in terms of being global guarantor of security, but things have happened. And there is always a risk that China could find itself caught up in that dynamic and heading in directions and doing things that it never really wanted to do. There's no guarantee. I don't think China wants to go down that route, as I said, but it's possible. So I just want to look at this very briefly from a number of different perspectives, starting with global governance. And we have, China has made it clear its dissatisfaction with the status quo, the US-led global order, and aspires to replace it, and has come up with this concept of a community of common destiny or future for mankind. At the moment, I think it's very difficult to know what to make of that, because it has been formulated in very unspecific terms. I think unless and until we get greater specificity, China is going to find this a difficult sell. I think a lot of countries are saying, yes, that's fine, we're okay with this, mainly because, they see this as a useful means of keeping China on side and, not getting on the wrong side of them. But, unless and until we know what this means and what it would actually imply, it's not going to be easy to convince people. And next, I would go to the military dimension. Over the last 20 years, we have seen a quite remarkable transformation in China's military capabilities. It is, I watched it. My first engagements with the PLA when it was still a low-tech, land-based force with no real capacity to project power overseas. And now look at what we've got. It really is remarkable. And that then begs the question, okay, what's China going to do with this? Is China going to become more assertive militarily around the world? Is China going to acquire more military bases than the very few that it currently has? What's it going to do with all this naval power that it is able to project? And again, we don't really know what the answer to that is. Then we come to technology. There we see a China that is engaged in a race with the United States to exercise dominance over the next generations of technology, which up until now the United States has dominated. And this is something really difficult for the United States to come to terms with, the idea that, having been technologically dominant for basically the last century, the possibility that they may have to give way. I personally don't think that this is a contest that anyone can actually win. I think that the technologies are too complex, too fungible for it to be possible for any one power to achieve absolute dominance in all of these. But certainly China has set its sights on becoming the global standard setter for the next generation of technologies, and has some ideas about changes to the internet, which on the face of it would take the internet in a much more authoritarian direction. Now, countries in the global south are perhaps more ambivalent about this. In this part of the world, very much not ambivalent, and very unhappy about the idea of an internet that evolves away from the open, multi-stakeholder model that has evolved kind of organically over the last 30 years. So I think that is something to watch. And finally, and I'll say this because, of course, wouldn't I, given my background, intelligence. I think there is a very interesting situation developing here. And I wonder, how China is going to take this forward. I have no problem with China collecting intelligence. All states do it. International law is broadly permissive, and there is nothing in international law that says thou shalt not spy. So, legally, it's kind of okay to do it. But I think, in China's case, I'm worried about, the potential for this to move from collection against issues of national security and national advantage to something that is much more granular and potentially starts to affect individuals and interest groups in ways that certainly, again, here in the West, we would not find it very, very comfortable to deal with. So, using social media and other electronic media to covertly promote China's interests by trying to shape public opinion at a very granular level. TikTok has been cited in this regard, and I have to say I think there is a case to be made. So I'll sum up because I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. We're in a very interesting period here. I know Chinese politicians and scholars tend to complain, in my view, with justification about what they call the 中国威胁论, the China threat, this idea that the West is putting out a narrative of China as a threat in order to disadvantage China internationally and hold it back in relation to its aspirations. And there is, I guess, some truth to that. But it also, I think, does, reflect a degree of genuine apprehension and concern about how China will exercise the very obvious power that it possesses going forward.
Thank you very much. All right, I will abuse the chair's privilege by asking the first question, which is we've seen an extraordinary change in the last 8 weeks of the financial situation for the international order. Let's just remind ourselves that last financial year, the United States gave some $12 billion in extra budgetary support to the United Nations system. 12 billion in addition to the 22% of the regular budget that is the United States contribution to the core budget of the UN. There's also been obviously the decision by the UK government to reduce overseas development to bolster defence expenditure. So my question really is perhaps first question is would we not expect China to naturally try and fill that gap? What is China's position on funding the international order as well as playing a leading role in the international order?
Let me give you an example about the Chinese military budget, since you are talking about this kind of figures. Yeah? For decades, China's military expenditure have been on a steady rise, but it's still kept somewhere around the 1.5% or below 1.5%. I always believe in international relations, there are two things that won't lie. One is geography. If you want to know the policy of North Korea, no matter what they said, no matter when and how they would fire missiles here and there, the truth is the whole peninsula is 1,100 kilometers. That means for any kind of a consideration to use a tactical nuclear bomb, dropping on Seoul is entirely suicidal, right? So this is the geography. The second thing is the defense budget. Defense budget tells a lot about what you think about yourself, what you think about environment, and what you think about your adversary, right? Well, during Cold War, yeah, Nigel might correct me. If UK's defense budget might be over 6%, right? Yeah. So yeah, and so it's real. And right now, Japan has double its defense expenditure. It shows that Japan is panicking. India has drastically increased its expenditure, but China is still more or less the same. Yeah. So it tells a lot about China's confidence. Yeah, for itself. I think this kind of confidence really matters. Just now, I'd like to raise this question: where China is going. We cannot be too sure, but I would say that China would never have 800 military bases. For what? Right? We only have one. And then that reminds the question. That is about a sphere of influence. If you want to have 800, that means you want to have sphere influence. You want to have alliance. China doesn't want to have sphere influence or alliance. Why? Even if China wants to have sphere influence, you can hardly argue anywhere in the world to be China's sphere influence. Look at East Asia, which is closer to China. DPRK won't listen to China. And in South Asia, which is often described as the backyard of China, well, we have quite a few countries which have territorial disputes with China. And we have quite a few countries who are American allies. So where can you have this kind of sphere of influence? But my argument is, precisely because China's influence is already global, Therefore, it doesn't need to have spheres of influence. People sometimes confuse these two things. Influence and sphere of influence are totally different. China's economic influence is ubiquitous. So why should you have all these 800 bases? Why should you need allies or allies, which is costly? And it's also difficult to herd cats, right? Sometimes.
So thank you. I mean, herding cats is difficult, but funding cats, as it were, or funding the United Nations activities is also a challenge. And I just wondered, again, this funding gap, because that is a fundamental question. You know, China is a bit different to Russia, right? Russia over the last 20, 30 years has been a revisionist actor in its region. China has benefited from the global order in terms of its economic rise. If you see that stepping away from funding the UN system, particularly from the United States, will China choose to bridge that funding gap? I realize a lot of that's about non-military spending, but it might also apply to actually funding peacekeeping, for example, as well. So additional funding. But yeah, any views on this?
First, very quick to your answer about the funding to the United Nations system. I think every country has its responsibility and contribution. China will decide this contribution according to our responsibility and also according to the development periods. I mean, when China is very, very poor, so we are, I mean, assisted by the United Nations system. And now we develop ourselves, we have more money. Of course, we will show the more responsibility, and we will contribute more to the United Nations system to provide more public goods. So that's for sure. But I cannot say to what extent it will fill the gap. It's not a kind of intention to fill the gap. It's because naturally we develop. We want to do more goods. So that's my quick answer to your question. But could you allow me to first respond to Nigel's response?
Yeah.
Because it's a panel, I think the students express some crosstalk. And also the very interesting presentation from Mr. Nigel is that actually he raised many questions. I mean, he raised many questions. So I would like to first respond to those questions. I think I would like to start with one point. Nigel mentioned that when UK and US when they developed, they did not plan. I mean, to take over the control, take the world gradually. They did not plan to colonize. But at first, I would like to ask a question to the students from India or from other countries. So did they invite them to there? And then following the question is that because my background is international law, my PhD thesis is the freedom of navigation in international law. So I studied very systematically the development of the rules of international law regarding the freedom of navigation. So that also plays out in this conversation because the freedom of navigation, if you look at the practice of China and UK and the Netherlands, you could see that before, I think it's 1898. I couldn't remember exactly. Before Vasco da Gama landed on Calcutta. Before that, 6 years before that, Zhou Bo has already began his 7 voyages. But we left no colony. But if you look at what the Western book described, what happened when da Gama landed in Calcutta, lots of robberies. Not to say gradually there the colonization, but why this happened? I mean, why? I mean, people like Nigel have this kind of questions that China want to take control of the world. China, I mean, not only in one specific issues, I mean, but in a systematically way. I think for my answer is that so. For many people, they have their own logic. I mean, I call it Western logic. They just apply their own logic to what the reality tells them what the China is. So when they see the fact, the reality, they think that because China is has grown, they think China will also act as what they have acted before. So I think this is the reason why this kind of questions always came up. And also, I mean, if you apply the logic that that is when you become powerful, they want to take control of the world. Let's look at the history of China. Not to say the example, Senator Zhou Bo has mentioned about the non-use of force after the China-Vietnam border war. You know, we traditionally, we are quite strong at army. You know, we are a kind of army power. I mean, army, you know, still the name of the Chinese military is PLA, People's Liberation Army. I mean, even I'm a retired Navy captain, but our Navy is called PLA Navy. So we actually quite strong at Navy, at Army. I mean, we fought the Liberation War, the Aggression War. You know, the Chairman Mao, he has many regular war series. We have Art of War in Sun Tzu. So we are quite experienced at fighting land wars. And also we are quite strong in terms of army building. That's a fact. But against that background, did we invade any of our neighbors? So contrary to the fact, among the 14 countries which are our land neighbors, we signed through peaceful ways with 12 countries. I mean, the treaty excluding India and that country is Bhutan. So we signed in a peaceful way treaties with all our land neighbors. But if you apply the Western logic, because we are quite strong at the army, we should take control of more armies. Then gradually, when we develop ourselves, when we have more security concerns, we develop our Navy to protect ourselves and also to protect public goods. So that's not that we want to take control of the world. The development is still the priority of Chinese people, of Chinese also as a nation. Finally, Nigel also mentioned the technology, the dominance of Chinese technology. But what I see from the development of DeepSeek is just an opposite example how China wants to provide public goods. Because with DeepSeek, all the Asian countries, the Latin American countries, those underdeveloped countries, they have opportunity. They have opportunity to develop their AI infrastructure. Because with the open AI, with ChatGPT, they are still using the previous traditional Western hegemonical technological approach. That is, we develop this technology, you can use it, but you have to pay for it. You have to pay for it in a very high price. But with the DeepSeek, the countries from the global south, they have opportunity to develop themselves. They have opportunity, I mean, to match the digital gap. It's a kind of democratization of AI governance.
Yeah.
Can I intervene there? Because I think Dr. Tian, you said something very interesting almost in parenthesis about the PLA Navy providing public goods. And this was a question I wanted to ask both you and Colonel Zhou Bo. In a post-American world to which we clearly are moving, who does provide public goods of this kind? Who does it, if not a hedge fund?
Mhm.
How do we manage this? I mean, we need to keep sea lanes of communication open. There are various other international networks and linkages that we need to protect and maintain. Who's going to do this?
Okay.
How's it going to work?
Well, very interesting questions. Nigel's question brings this concept of so-called free and open Indo-Pacific, right? This is what is being championed. In my argument, I would say that, just give me an example, when are oceans not open and not free? Because the sea, all the oceans are interconnected, right? So this is not a pseudo question. When the United States talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific, basically the United States is trying to blame China to say, okay, the sea is not open and free because of China. This is wrong. If you just think of any crime at the sea, you just can't think many, like piracy, maritime terrorism, and what is that? Human trafficking, just some petty crime, basically. So at the sea, the crimes are never very, very big. And the root cause is on land, just like what is happening in the Red Sea. It's because of Houthi, right? So it's because of the situation in Gaza. So this is about it. And then in the South China Sea, Americans would have a lot of cane. But every year there are about 100,000 ships passing through South China Sea. And you can hardly give me examples that China is sabotaging the freedom of navigation of all these ships. And then we come to this very concept of freedom of navigation, the importance of international sea lanes. Of course, are important, but I believe that they are not really major issues. Just for people to know, even during the Cold War, yeah, neither United States nor Soviet Union tried to block international straits. Yeah, from time to time you would hear Iran talking about blocking Hormuz, which they didn't do anyway. So I don't believe that is a real issue at all.
Let me add one point. One of the regular questions I meet as an international lawyer is that China is kind of a free rider of the United States because they are providing public good in terms of securing the land of international communication. But the question is, why the United States want to provide this kind of public goods for all the world? Is it purely for the interest of the coastal states, for the purely of other countries? Because they have more than 800 military bases. They want to use it as kind of also free lines for their military free movements. I mean, if you look at the policy paper in 1983 by the presidents, it's very obvious here. They want to keep the free moving of in terms of the maritime communication. It's because they want to their military have the free movement. That's another fact.
Well, look, we talked a little bit about the maritime and the movement of the maritime. Obviously, there are two different conceptions of the Asian order at the moment, one of which is Eurasian and land-based, which tends to be, I would argue, preferred by both Beijing and Moscow, and one of which is more maritime, the different conceptions of the Indo-Pacific, which tend to be a flavor of the month if you're in Canberra or Washington or Delhi or indeed in Paris or Berlin or London, for those who think that Indo-Pacific strategies are the preserve of Brexiteers. I just wanted to ask about technology for a moment, because there is this reality, and Nigel, you alluded to it, but in a world in which data is commodified, in which data is material to our economies, in a world in which there is an AI race underway with unclear outcomes as of, will it be DeepSeek, will it be the US aggregation that's present at the moment, will it be available to all, and there'll be small companies in Slovenia that suddenly become unicorns on the back of this. There's radical uncertainty about the future of tech. But what is clear is what Nigel alluded to, that there's a risk here of cognitive warfare. This is the ability to take all the tools that have been developed in the last 20 to 30 years from financial services, from advertising, from micro-targeting into social media, and actually be able to influence at scale individuals in large societies. And for democracies, that is a concern that they might have. So I just want to ask about, there's one debate about freedom of navigation. What about freedom of data and freedom of information? Because I think that's also been a live issue, is it fair to say, around some of the new debates around DeepSeek. But as I understand it, you ask certain questions and there are no answers. The answer sort of self-deletes itself. So there may be bad information in other AI. It may hallucinate. But how much should there be that right to access data and information, but also have some limits on what commercial and government actors can do vis-a-vis the data of citizens from other countries?
Well, to be frank, that is the reality in China. You're not allowed to have access of all kinds of information, and a lot of people would have to use a kind of VPN to get the necessary information. This has created a lot of inconvenience, yeah? Whether this is the right thing to do or not, well, that is the decision of the Chinese government, yeah? I'm not supposed to comment on that, but I think there's the fact that in China, VPN is still very much tolerated, probably tells you more about China, right? So Chinese government, on one hand, feel the need to do something, but on the other hand, it is not trying to block all the VPNs, because if they want to do it, they definitely couldn't just shut all of them down, right? But still, so they have left something open, right? You could have a different kind of VPNs. So this is about China. So I believe China really would confuse a lot of people. Yeah, because everything in China, to some extent, is true. Just like China, is China a developing country or developed country? Yeah, I can answer this question another way. If, for example, in 10 years' time, China really becomes the most, China really becomes the largest economy in the world. So is China still a developing country? Chinese government say, yes, of course, we're always a developing country. If it is divided by a huge population, of course, China is always a developing country, right? And then how can the largest economy in the world be a developing country at the same time? Then what is the point of dividing country into developed country, developing country, if the largest economy is a developing country, right? But so China is wearing many hats, and all of them are true. China is the largest exporter, largest industrial nation, right? So largest exporter in the world, and by PPP, China is already the largest economy in the world. But at the same time, China is also a developing country. So I think this is why people are confused. You know, even the clever Germans would be confused to ask me this kind of question, right? I'm confused too sometimes. Yeah.
You heard it here first. The clever Germans may be confused. That's how challenging it is. But of course, there is an irony here also about Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar in December talked about India's leading role in the global south, and that's something you hear from Chinese leaders as well. But I do want to stick on technology for a moment. Nigel, do you want to come in on the technology question?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in an interesting state here. If you look at what artificial intelligence can be used for. I mean, like all technologies, it's kind of neutral. It can be used for bad, or for good. But you look at the role of AI in protecting, in undertaking cyber attacks, malware and so on, and the role of AI in protecting against these attacks. The evidence is starting to come in, suggest that AI probably is going to favor defense, which is kind of good in terms of dealing with the massive vulnerabilities we currently face. When it comes to cognitive operations, it's beginning to look as if the opposite is true. In other words, AI is going to be able, is going to empower states to undertake cognitive operations against populations at a granular individual level in ways that will actually prove very difficult to defend against. So this is a real issue that we have to worry about. It's also worth remembering in the Chinese context, I think it was about 2-3 years ago, China declared that data was a factor for production, just like land, capital, and labor. So, data at that point takes on very, very different connotations. Essentially, the more you have of it, the better. Draw your own conclusions on that.
Well, look, I do want to open up to questions, but I just want to ask one final question, because obviously one of the key dynamics here is the US-China relationship. You have on the one hand, Graham Allison, the Harvard professor, who's argued that when you have a rising power and an established power, most of the time it does lead to some form of conflict or friction. And there's certainly the question mark about what would happen if there was a crisis, an inadvertent crisis or a deliberate crisis around Taiwan, in the South China Sea, a wider crisis on US-China relations. I just wanted to quickly ask, and perhaps for a very quick response, if I may, there are some who would argue that such a crisis would only ever be engineered by a party. What is the risk, thinking about the history of the offshore islands crisis, thinking about previous crises in East Asia, what's the risk of an inadvertent crisis between the United States and China? And can dialogue be a helpful vehicle for that? Not just the win-win dialogue of Guanxi, but thinking about that sort of informal dialogue, the track 1.5 dialogues, where people can be a little bit more honest sometimes than is always possible when one's on the record. Colonel.
I shall try my best to be concise. I wrote an article that was published in South China Morning Post titled is South China Sea stupid, which is also in the book. If you want to buy the book and read it, okay, that'd be fine. Yeah. I always argue South China Sea is more dangerous than Taiwan Strait. Why is that? Because Americans keep on sending aircraft and ships, and a stronger China feel the need to push back. And so, from time to time, the distance between the aircraft and the ships are just too close. Yeah, is there a way of resolving this issue? I don't think so. Unfortunately, I feel very, very sad to say that I just don't believe there is a way to resolve it. Because for decades, China and the US have been fighting on one word. That in Chinese is one word, 安全. But for Chinese, it's security. For US, it's safety. They talk about safety of crews and sailors, and we talk about China's national security. So my conclusion is, unless and until we have another deadly collision, I don't believe either side will become who-headed. Yeah. For Taiwan issue, why it is less dangerous? Because there can't be an unintended accident in Taiwan Strait that will trigger a war. If there is a war in Taiwan Strait, whatever the reason it might be, it is intended. So in South China Sea, it's because of American aircraft, yeah, and ships, so frequently coming of such heightened intensity. That is the most dangerous.
Do you want to add anything on this?
I do not want to add.
Okay. Nigel, do you want to say anything about this one?
No, I actually agree with Colonel Zhou on this. I think the South China Sea is a much more likely flashpoint. I mean, I'm involved in an exercise called Taiwan Risk Advisory. We look at Taiwan on a monthly basis and estimate the change in probability of 3 short-term scenarios. And we're talking about a risk at the moment well below 50%. And this is mainly directed at the private sector, financial management, and most of the time we're saying to them, don't panic. I think one issue that the Americans frequently raise, I don't know whether either Colonel Zhou or Dr. Tian would want to talk about that, is that although crisis communication mechanisms do exist, China tends not to pick up when the phone rings. And that potentially is a worry. I don't know whether either of you say something about that.
Oh, let me tell you the story. It is true that sometimes the United States, the senior American military official would call, and sometimes Chinese did not pick up the phone call. But the reason behind is sometimes I believe Chinese know what the Americans want to say. Yeah. So even without taking on the phone, they already know what you want to say. Yeah. So and by not answering the phone, this is already a gesture itself. Yeah. The other thing is sometimes Americans want to talk to. Sometimes Americans don't want to talk to the counterparts. They want to talk to someone who is more senior. For example, American would argue that our Secretary of Defense should talk to your Vice Chairman of the Central Military Commission, not your Defense Minister. Your Defense Minister is not as important as Secretary of the Defense in the United States. But the point is, China really has a Defense Minister, right? Yeah. So what is the function, what is the capacity of Chinese Defense Minister, right? So I think we have a Defense Minister. If you don't talk to him, then it's not just logical. And if you talk to him, this at least on paper looks equal, and he still can just convey your concern and your questions to higher authority, right? So sometimes they just make this kind of not answering the phone call as a kind of excuse.
Just one point. At operational level, I mean, at the operating level and between the ships, I mean, they have actually a kind of public channel, that public channel 16, and also China they also applies queues. So queues is all also kind of public communication channel.
Thank you. And obviously, one of the challenges here is both public and private. Now, talking of communication channels, I did promise some questions, so let me open it up in the room. And I saw a hand just there. Can I please encourage you to keep questions brief? And perhaps we'll take 3 at a time, if that's okay. So the gentleman there first, yeah.
Yes, thank you. More on the South China Sea court case, especially the permanent court of arbitration. China's stance of non-participation and non-acceptance, should that be a concern about how China's states or I-6 the international law? Thank you.
Thank you. Got a question here. Can we just wait for the mic to come over? That mic just here. Yeah. Sorry, there's someone here. Oh no, sorry, this one here. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. I have basically the same question, but to be more specific, what do you think is the best way to defend our territory and also the sovereignty?
Again?
Regarding the South China Sea problem. So what do you think the best way to defend our territory, as a Chinese?
That means you're Chinese, right?
Yeah, that's
There's always a bit of debate on some of this. Can I just, yes, this gentleman here, and then let's take these 3, and then we'll come back around for another round.
Hi, thank you for sharing. So I have one question. So firstly, do you agree that because recently Li Ka-shing have sold the Panama port to BlackRock, and regarding this, do you agree that the world is changing from globalization to deglobalization? And because this will cause the issue of internal supply within the economics in each world, and it's not sustainable. So the first question is how the China future economy is gonna look like. And the second question is, do you believe that 在商言商 is still online? Because typically for ports, the selling P ratio is 8 to 10 times. But for this time, Li Ka-shing sold it for 12x, which is much higher than the price a typical port was sold. So do you think, how does it affect the future financial market or within Hong Kong and also the China economy? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
No. The first question is very simple. China refused the ruling of the International Maritime Tribunal just because China believed this is about sovereignty, sovereignty issue, which was actually which should be excluded from this kind of ruling, because if you read the UN Convention Law of the Sea, if you read the preamble, you would find that the law of the sea itself is not for resolving sovereignty issue, and China believes it is sovereignty issue. What I need to tell you is that Philippines sued us, in 2013, but as early as 2006, China has made a declaration to say that we would not accept any ruling on the Article 298. So that means at that time, China should have no idea that one day the country called Philippines would sue it. So that means about China's position on this point, China really believes that we would not participate in any kind of dispute on Article 298 regarding maritime delineation or territory. So I think that is a good example. Yeah, but of course people would say that this is not about sovereignty. Then that is another issue there. Yeah. Then the second question is how could we defend the Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity in South China Sea? I would say China so far has tried its best, to defend the China sovereignty and the territorial integrity in South China Sea without triggering a war, right? So far there is no war, and China has promised not to use force, in the so-called Declaration of Code of Conduct in South China Sea that is made in 2002, so which forbid any country from using force. Why this issue of China Philippines suddenly crop up? It's very simple, because the rusty ship could no longer stay there. Mother Nature is playing a role. So Filipino believe that they have to, carry some cement to fortify it, and China would not allow that. And why would China not allow that? Because in 1999, Philippines promised to tow away the ships that they have stranded in Second Thomas Shoal, but they didn't honor it. For example, if China want to use force against 1 or 2 dozen Filipinos on the ship, how easy it would be for us, right? But China has been very, very tolerant. And as I told you, you know, even Filipino have dictating Chinese, which is true. You can be Google. The third question is whether business people should only take care of business without talking politics. I try to translate your Chinese into English, I believe. It's more or less a question like that. I'm not a businessman, so I really believe, okay, probably doing business should follow certain kind of business rules. But in this complicated world, I don't believe that anything is purely business. Yeah. For example, if Saudi Arabia want to buy aircraft from the United States, is it about business? No, because they believe that buying such weapons from the United States, they could have a strategic assurance from the United States. So it's not really totally, you know, politics free. This world is not politics free. It's everywhere.
And given my legal background, I mean, I'd like to add something to the first question. I think you are not, excuse me, expecting to tell official lines in terms of the South Chinese arbitration. I have 2 points. First, I mean, in terms of the legal terms, first, given the fact Ito Aba, an island which is now occupied by our Taiwanese brothers, I mean, this island, I mean, by itself is kind of natural islands, and the Taiwanese local government and their scholars have already invited the judges to come to the island to see whether it is a naturally formed island, which fits with the articulation within the UNCLOS, which means if it is a natural island, it enjoys 200 nautical mile EEZ, 1,200 miles territorial sea, that the existence of one natural island alone can destroy the whole argument of the arbitration case. That's the first point. Second, military, Senator Zhou Bo just mentioned about the exemption of sovereignty issues. Sovereignty is not governed by the UNCLOS. It's written very clearly in the preamble of the UNCLOS. Another example in military activities. So if you look at the report of the many media, Western media, when they write the report, they would say many times that these are Chinese military activities, but in the arbitration case, it is not military activities. So just think about it. And also, let me also ask you a question. Is the use of nuclear force against international law? I mean, does international law allow the use of nuclear force? Let me tell you directly that I should not say ridiculous judgment or opinion by the ICG. So the judges discussed for quite a long time. They reached consensus. In extreme cases, it is allowable to use nuclear weapons. And then, but before that, they discussed in quite a long details that how the use of nuclear weapons is against various areas of international law. But that is the argument of ICG. And also, finally, I've also mentioned one fact. We all know that last week, the former Philippine president, Mr. Duterte, again, was in custody at The Hague. But at the same time, I would like to mention the fact hundreds of thousands of civilian lives has been taken in Gaza and in Russia, Ukraine. I mean, also in Afghanistan war, Iraq war, but for Trump the first term, also the second term, Ms. Pompeo just sanctioned the ICC prosecutor. Also this time. So just think about it.
Do you want to say anything on this?
No, I don't think I will.
Okay, our last round. I'm gonna go if that's right. The lady there, sorry, second row. There's a lady right at the back who's been waiting. We'll do 4. Okay, lady there, gentleman here, man. We can close out. Yeah, please keep it short. Yeah.
Last month, the PLA conducted live firing drills without notice between New Zealand and Australia, and this forced civilian aircraft to divert. How does this serve the public good?
Okay, thank you. why don't we come here and then we'll go back? Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Zhou. I think if there's a persistent dispute for Chinese ruler between the land-based strategy and maritime strategies, even we can trace back to the later Qing dynasty between Zhuo Zongtang and Li Hongzhang. So my question would be, especially when President Xi becomes the permanent leader, and we see a huge military reform in Chinese PLA Navy. So what's China's maritime strategy in 21st centuries now could overcome what you said, the China's geographical limitation? That's going to be my question.
Thank you. And Carolyn, right at the back, there's a lady just by, yeah, you've got one, that's fine. Yeah.
The India, I don't think this is working.
No, please use the mic. It is working. Just
It is working?
speak loudly into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
The India-China relationship has been described as both a relationship of both cooperation and deterrence. Given India's sort of greater focus and role in the Indo-Pacific, how does China perceive India through the lens of both the US-China relationship and the US-India relationship?
Thank you. And we've got one final question with gentleman over here. And then we're going to come back for a very, very speed round, if that's all right, on the panel, so that we close out.
So China's foreign policy has changed, like under different leadership, like Deng Xiaoping, Mao, they'll have different like foreign policies. And I'm wondering what's the trend in next 10, 15 years or in the far more in the future? Would Chinese foreign policy change? And would that affect your answer to should the world fear China? Thank you.
So an easy 4 questions to quickly respond to.
Yeah, okay. On the first question, the Chinese exercise in the high sea between Australia and New Zealand is perfectly legitimate because it's on the high sea. But whether China should, inform, which it did, allowing more time in advance. Yeah, if this is not the case, I think China should improve it. Yeah, next time to have more time to give a prior notification. The second question is about China's maritime strategy in the 21st century. I think Chinese Navy wants to become world-class Navy by 2049. That is not a secret. But for a big country like China, China has 2 more responsibilities for its military. All militaries would do national defense, right? But for major powers, they have two things more. One is to protect your overseas interests. The other one is to show your international responsibilities. Chinese counter-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden is a perfect example. Why? Because China has escorted about 8,000 ships. Half of them are Chinese ships. That is national interest. But half of them are foreign ships. That is China's national interest, international responsibilities. Then the third question about the China-India relationship reflected in the Indian Ocean, I would say that India doesn't like Chinese Navy to be there because the Indian government's position is India is a net security provider in Indian Ocean. That's surprising. How can the Indian government describe itself as a net security provider? That means no other country can provide security. This is impossible because the Indian Ocean clearly is not India's ocean, right? So first of all, this is really wrong. But then I believe Chinese Navy is already there. First for counter-piracy, and then for safeguarding the international ceiling. So like it or not, Chinese Navy will be there. But we may not behave like the United States, trying to avail, dozens of military bases whatsoever. Then the last question, wonderful. In the next 10 to 15 years, how would Chinese diplomacy look like? I believe, okay, this is what I said when I had an interview with Time magazine. When China started reform and opening up, Chinese approach is described by Deng Xiaoping as getting across the river by feeding the stones at the riverbed, right? But now we have waded into the sea. You can't feel the seabed, but there's no turning back. Yeah, and that is how China would have to go forward. And this is already happening. China's success in successfully mediating between Saudis and Iranians, for me, is a turning point for Chinese diplomacy to become more proactive, because Chinese diplomacy in the past was characterized with more no's than yes, right? Even if these no's are right, non-interference, so on and so forth, but they are no's. No's are no's. But in the future, you are a big power, and you have to pay a big price, for being a big power. So you should go ahead to provide more public security goods whenever and wherever possible to the rest of the world.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to say?
I just want to, the last point I was mentioning that many of the questions relate to the China phobia. So I'd like to invite all the foreign friends and fellow students to come to China to see with your own eyes. In particular, we did not discuss human rights issue, which actually, because I studied in Nottingham Law School, enjoy a very good reputation in terms of the international human rights law. So in this area, again, when you come to, let's say Xinjiang, because Xinjiang is a big human issue in the Western media, the genocide, the forced labor, just go to Xinjiang to see with your own eyes whether they are atrocities, whether they are genocides, whether they are forced labors. But it's just ridiculous against the basic facts. I mean, just give you one example, like the forced labor. Actually, in Xinjiang, most of areas the cotton could be collected by the machines, but in some areas, which is not suitable for the machines to cut it, then they are a kind of migrant labor force from Henan, from some other province. They actually make a living on that. So if you, did not give them opportunity to do the job, then how can they make a living? So just come to China to see with your own eyes, to see why our priority is still development. Thank you.
Thank you. I should say, obviously, plenty of contested debate, including from LSE academics, about what is going on in China and particularly what is perhaps not always reported in the same way. Nigel, any final closing statement from your side?
No, I think what Colonel Zhou had to say about China providing more in the way of international public goods is encouraging. And I think if China is in a position to engage in mediation in conflicts because of a particular situation or particular capability that it has, this is something that we should certainly not seek to discourage.
Well, look, thank you very much. LSE's mission is to connect curious minds with challenging ideas. And I think you've heard a range of ideas this evening, many of which you may not agree with, some of which you may agree with. But we are committed to providing a platform here for a variety of different perspectives globally. I think I was trying to think about how to extend the entering into the water and feeling with your toes underneath. And I was thinking of paddle boarding. For anybody who paddle boards, that thing of trying to stand up on a board and constantly rebalancing your core to stay up. And it strikes me that one of the themes that we've touched on, I think, this evening is the fact for many countries in the world, 140 or so countries but are stuck in the middle with you, right? Who are not choosing to align fully with the United States, nor are they choosing to align fully with Beijing. For them, I think there is a constant balancing and rebalancing and trying not to fall off as people navigate. It goes just goes for me to say thank you very much to our brilliant panel. Thank you, Zhou Bo, Nigel Lingster, Tianchi Chen. Thank you very much for joining us. Please join in.